And we'll pick up with more on sexual selection. We've been talking about intras, uh, intraspecific competition, competition between members of one sex for breeding rights to members of the other sex. Sometimes this can be rather violent, other times it can be a lot more subtle. And we talked about Bateman's rule, where often the competitive sex is male. However, we now know that that's very often reversed. The more general rule is whichever sex invests less in each reproductive event is the one that competes more. And there's plenty of species where it's the females that fight over access to particularly choice males. There's a British bird called the moorhen, for example, where the males are actually the ones that will sit on the eggs and incubate them, and I think they don't feed during that time. So the males have to spend a couple of weeks sitting on the eggs, and in that case, the male invests a great deal into successful reproduction, and females actually compete with each other for access to the fattest males. Because the plumper the male, the better a job he'll be able to do in incubating those eggs without food. So you get lots of cases of that happening, and so Bateman's rule is often reversed, and selection can modify it further, as in the case of the redback spider that we talked about. So we talked about competition in one sex for access to mating opportunities. The other aspect of sexual selection is that members of one sex will choose which members of the opposite sex they'll mate with. Bateman's rule says it's females that do the choosing of which males they'll accept, but this can, of course, be reversed as well. You can have lots more complicated outcomes than just that. And the funny thing is that mate choice often seems to happen on the basis of strangely arbitrary characters. Why do female zebra finches love males with the brightest orange beaks? Why do um, Caribbean moths in the genus Utaphasia really prefer to mate with males that have the most noxious flavor? What is it about these features that makes them the target of sexual selection? Why do female Laws Parotia birds of paradise prefer to mate with the males that do the most ridiculous looking dance? What is it about these things? Why do mates pick mates with bright colors or um, strange movements or interesting aromas or loud calls or things like that? And there's several hypotheses to explain that have been proposed. And we'll go through all of these, and they're not mutually exclusive. Real world cases could be explained by a combination of these. Assortative mating is mating of similar individuals, mates picking mates that are like themselves over mates that aren't. Dissortative mating is the opposite, mates picking mates that are different from themselves. In some cases, mates can gain a direct benefit from the mates that they choose. Sometimes picking a particular mate directly gives you something that helps you survive. We'll see an example of that in a bit. There's also the hypothesis that certain traits that are the target of sexual selection are markers of good genes. That if you pick a mate with bright colors, that's adaptive, because mates with bright colors tend to have uh, good genes by some criterion, and we'll look at that in more detail in a bit. Aspects of that are what's called the handicap principle and also hybridization avoidance. We'll talk about those in a little bit. In some cases, there may just be a bias in the way that mates have their sensory organs wired up that makes them choose certain mates over others. And then there's something called runaway selection, which basically says that mate choice happens simply because it happens. So let's look at these. Assortative mating is the preference for mates that are similar to oneself. And to some extent, this is, very reasonable because, by definition, if you mate with something outside your own species, you're not going to have offspring. Or if you do, you're not likely to have as many, or they might be otherwise poorly adapted or something like that. So there has to be some sort of assortative mating going on, to keep you from mating with something that, is not a species you can have offspring with at all. There's the old joke about the nearsighted snake that crawled into a barn and crawled up to a garden hose and said, "Hey, baby, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" Clearly, if a snake tries to breed with a garden hose, there aren't going to be any babies that result. So snakes that can detect what objects in their world are members of their own species and choose them, those snakes are going to leave more offspring than snakes that can't tell the difference between a lady snake and a garden hose. So at some level, assortative mating ensures that you're mating with members of your own species. Dissortative mating is a preference for mates that are different from yourself. One possible example is inbreeding avoidance. Remember, inbreeding, well, you know what inbreeding is. Inbreeding results in increased homozygosity and an increased risk of offspring that are homozygous for something harmful. So many species have mechanisms in place that have been selected to minimize the chances of inbreeding. And one of these might be dissortative mating. Being attracted to mates that are not exactly like you is one way of ensuring that you're not mating with your own siblings or something like that. So here's an example. This is an insect that practices assortative mating. If you look at this graph down here on the y-axis, you've got female size, and on the x-axis you have male size, and you can see that these fit a straight line reasonably well. Big males tend to mate with big females, and little males tend to mate with little females. In this case, this results from the fact that everybody wants to mate with big females because the bigger a female, the more eggs she can lay. Everybody wants to mate with the big females. The big males can beat up the small males and stuff their heads in toilets or whatever the equivalent is among root weevils. And the small males are left with only the small females to mate with. So in this case, you have assortative mating, but it's the result of a preference that all beetles have. All beetles prefer mating with large females. It's just the large males are the ones that are best able to act on that preference. Okay, so that's a case of assortative mating. Here's another one. There's been a lot of work done on butterflies in the Amazon basin belonging to the genus Heliconius. There are a lot of species. They're beautiful and interesting. Many of them mimic each other. They tend to evolve the same protective coloration several times over. And there's two species shown here, Heliconius eratocerbia and Heliconius himera. They're capable of hybridizing, but they rarely do. They'll prefer mates of their own color pattern. So that's assortative mating. If Hemera prefers to mate with mates that look like Hemera, and Eratoserbia prefers to mate with other Eratoserbias. The reason seems to be that the local predators have evolved to recognize and avoid these patterns of warning coloration. Um, the orange and yellow and red that you see, that is a signal that, hey, I taste really bad. You don't want to eat me. And the local predators have learned to avoid these two patterns. Hybrids don't have familiar color patterns of either one of these. So hybrids are much likelier to get attacked and eaten. So there's selection against hybridizers. Think of it this way. Remember that the butterflies are not consciously thinking, hey, that one over there that's yellow and red looks really cute, and I would go over and ask for her number, but I'd better not. The butterflies aren't thinking this. It works like this. If you are a Heliconius erato and you prefer Hemeras, then your offspring are likely to get eaten. If you're a Heliconius erato and you prefer other Heliconius erato, then your offspring are not likely to get eaten because they will have the appropriate warning color pattern. So if you're a Heliconius erato that strongly prefers your own species, you'll leave offspring. If you're a Heliconius erato that doesn't prefer your own species, you won't leave offspring. And the same is, of course, true for Heliconius hemera in the other way. So that's assortative mating, and it results, we think, from selection against hybrids. If you produce hybrid offspring, your hybrid offspring get eaten. If you don't produce hybrid offspring, your offspring are likelier to live. Here's one where we don't really understand the reason why. This is the European corn borer moth, Astrenia nubialis. There are two different phenotypes. They're called E and Z, and they don't look any different. But in the moth world, it really doesn't matter what you look like. What matters is how you smell. Moths, many of them have extremely sensitive organs of smell, and they can respond to extremely low concentrations of pheromones, odor molecules that a moth produces to attract mates. And the difference between the E phenotype and the Z phenotype is not what they look like, it's what they smell like. And you can get E's and Z's to hybridize, and they're not at any known disadvantage. But for some reason that last I looked, we don't really understand, these moths do mate assortively. E moths with the E smell, tend to mate with other moths with the E smell, and Z moths tend to mate with other Z moths. So that's assortative mating, but we're not really sure why they're mating assortively, but we know that they are. For some reason, disortative mating is a lot more rare, but I was able to find one. Here's some white-throated sparrows that come in two different color morphs. You have a white striped morph on the left. You can see that has that white and yellow on its forehead over the eye. And you also have brown striped morphs, and there's one on the right. What's interesting is that's correlated with a chromosome inversion. If you look very carefully, there's a white-throated sparrow, and it's two copies of chromosome 2, and one has the centrosome there, and one has the centrosome there. Whereas here, this brown stripe morph, both of chromosomes 2 have the centrosomes there in the same position. And this is one of the things that can happen During meiosis, you can have errors in pairing up that cause a sizable part of a chromosome to break off and be put in the reverse order. You can end up with a piece of the chromosome put in backwards. That's a chromosome inversion. It happens all the time. And it doesn't necessarily cause any problems because as long as you've got the right number of genes, the order that you put them in is usually not that critical. Um, but as many as 98% of matings are between different color morphs. White-throated will tend to mate with brown rather than white preferring to mate with white. That's odd. So that's dissortative mating. And the reason seems to be that these are also correlated with behavior. The white morphs are more promiscuous and they're also more aggressive. Both sparrows prefer brown morphs, but white morphs beat up their brown competitors and take the brown girls for themselves. So both types prefer to mate with brown sparrows, but the white sparrows get them first, which means that the brown sparrows seeking mates can only mate with other white sparrows. Also, homozygous white morphs seem to show reduced fitness. We're not entirely sure why, but if you're a white sparrow and you mate with a white and your offspring have reduced fitness, they've got less of a chance to survive. That tends to favor white-throated sparrows that prefer brown striped mates. So you've got selection. In this case, it's against assortative mating. And you also have something similar to what we saw in the root weevil, where everybody wants to mate with brown sparrows, and the white sparrows are the ones that are able to actually do it because they beat up the competition. So that's a case of dissortative mating. There's cases where females select a trait on the basis of a direct benefit to them. And this is an example. This is a hanging fly. They're in the order Mecoptera. Dr. DeSword could tell you more about these. We do have them in Arkansas. I don't see them very often, but then I'm not usually looking for insects. And when it is time for, nature to make more hanging flies, these are predatory, and a male will capture an insect and present it to a female, kind of the equivalent of the box of chocolates. If the male's present isn't big enough, this is called a nuptial gift, by the way. If the male's nuptial gift isn't big enough, the female will say, "You don't bring me flowers anymore." Actually, the female will fly off. But if it's big enough that it attracts her attention, she'll eat it. And while she eats, they'll copulate. And copulation can last up to 20 minutes as the female eats the insect and the male clasps on and transfers sperm. And it looks like this. There's the male over there on the left, transferring sperm into the female. The female's holding a dead fly and eating it. And so females prefer males that bring them bigger nuptial gifts. A female will mate with a male that brings a great big housefly in preference to a male that's only got mosquitoes. I ain't saying she's a gold digger. The larger the food insect, the more direct benefit the female gets. Here, the female is selecting for something that directly provides a benefit to her. She gets calories. She gets a nutritious meal that she did not have to hunt. So that's pretty straightforward. The female is selecting, preferring to breed with males that give her a direct benefit. The male, by the way, benefits too, because the bigger the insect he brings, the better nourished the female is, and that means the more eggs she can produce. And it also means the more time he has to transfer his sperm. Um, Somebody actually did this, watched a bunch of hanging flies mating, drop them in liquid nitrogen at 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and found out that the number of sperm that a male can transfer into a female increases linearly over the span of 20 minutes. The longer she's eating, the more sperm he can transfer into her. So males that bring big nuptial gifts transfer more sperm and have more offspring than males that bring small nuptial gifts. So selection favors males that bring big gifts. Incidentally, the better fed the female is, the less likely that she will be receptive to another male. Um, Female insects can often store sperm from multiple males inside their bodies, sometimes for quite some time. Honeybee queens mate once in their lives and store that sperm for up to 2 years. Um, and so the more sperm he can place inside her, the more offspring she's going to have, and the less receptive she will be for other males to transfer their sperm. So selection favors males that bring big gifts and females that receive big gifts, right? A female who's satisfied with tiny gifts will not be as well nourished and probably won't produce as many eggs as a female that wants really big presents. Okay, so selection tends to be pulling in the same direction, favoring females that prefer big presents and males that give big presents. Okay, those two should be pretty straightforward, but now we come to the good genes part. Here's a three-spine stickleback. Sticklebacks are, I don't think we've got any in Arkansas. They tend to live farther north on both the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts of the northern half of the US and also Canada. They can tolerate fresh and salt water, and they have migrated from the ocean into a lot of rivers, lakes, and streams on both the North Atlantic and the North Pacific coasts. And we'll actually be coming back to them, but they've got pretty sophisticated mating behavior. Here's a male, and you'll notice he's got lots of red on his throat and his belly. What they'll do is, this is another one where the male takes care of the eggs and young. The male will swim down to the bottom and build a nest. And then he will swim up and try to attract a female to come down and lay her eggs in his nest, which he does by a swimming maneuver known as the headstanding dance, where he'll stick his head down, stick his tail up, and wriggle, showing off that bright red belly. So the male does the crazy belly dance with his bright red belly. If a female accepts him, she will go down and lay her eggs in his nest. And then he will come in, he'll fertilize them, and he will stand guard until the eggs hatch and the little babies can be off and on their own. Females prefer males with bright red bellies. The brighter, the bigger, the better. And about 20 years ago, this is getting kind of old results. It was shown that the degree of redness of a male stickleback was inversely correlated with the parasite load. These particular fish actually have a parasite. Those of you that took parasitology will be maybe familiar with the kind of thing. It creates black spots on the skin. And so it's fairly easy to look at a live fish and count how many parasites they've got. And The brighter a male was, the fewer parasites his offspring had. Red males had offspring with few parasites. Drab males had offspring on average with many parasites. And there's the data. The males that were the least red, that's between 75 and 100% of their offspring would get parasitized by a tapeworm. The really bright red males down here, almost none of them did. So there's the actual data from two separate ponds. And there's a male stickleback. You can see he's got lots of bright red right in there. So think about this. If you're a female and you mate with a drab male, your offspring are more likely to be parasitized. This particular parasite I don't think is lethal, but it does drain energy from the body of the host, meaning that if you're a female who mates with a drab male, your offspring are not going to have as much energy. They may not be as good at feeding. They may not be as vigorous. They may have a harder time attracting mates themselves. So if you're a female with a preference for bright red males, you're going to leave fewer offspring, and they'll leave fewer offspring. If you're a male that likes bright red males and just wants them, as red as possible, then your offspring are going to be much freer of parasites and have better chances of surviving and reproducing just because they will have more energy. So selection in that case has favored females that prefer males with bright red, because having bright colors is an indicator that the offspring are going to be healthier. That's an example of good genes. The hypothesis that members of one sex pick mates that have certain traits because those traits are markers of high genetic quality. Fish can't read each other's DNA. They can't send each other's saliva off to the lab for test results or anything like that. It just, there are some traits that are good markers of overall health, and females in this case that mate with males that have those traits will just have more offspring than females that mate with males that don't. In fact, this is a very general thing. Bright coloration using red and yellow pigments called carotenoids has actually been linked with low parasite levels in several different species of birds and fish. This is the red grouse from Northern Europe. And the male right here is rocking his brilliant red pair of red eyebrows. This is how a male red grouse says, "Ooh, baby, can I get your number?" It was shown in 2007 that if you took some red grouse and reduced roundworm infection, treated them with drugs to get rid of the roundworms, the bird's carotenoid levels went up, and the eye combs right there, these red eyebrows, got redder in birds that had been treated. So the amount of red, orange, and yellow pigment that many species can make seems to be correlated with the parasite load that that individual has. And if you mate with a really bright red, orange, yellow male, not only does your mate have fewer parasites, but your offspring will too, because parasite resistance can evidently be inherited. That's a trait that selection can act on. The likeliest hypothesis I found as to why this is that carotenoids directly stimulate the immune system. This is why you're supposed to eat lots of tomatoes and carrots and things like that. Those are high carotenoid foods, and those are supposed to be really good for you. They'll boost your immune system. They supposedly will protect you against cancer. I have not evaluated that claim and don't know that it's true, but there's certainly good reasons for you to eat your nice bright orange colored vegetables. And so the idea is that the amount of carotenoids you're showing off to a mate, like this male zebra finch with his cheek patches and his beak, the more carotenoids you can show off, that's a direct signal of how healthy your immune system is. Carotenoids being low means you've got a stressed immune system, and you're likely to be less healthy, and your offspring are likely to be less healthy as well. High carotenoids means you've got an immune system that can jump out of your body and beat people up. That'd be cool. That'd be cool if your immune system was so strong that, like, you could send it ahead of you into the supermarket and it could punch out anybody with COVID before you even walked in. That'd be a okay, I'm calling Marvel Comics. That would be one hell of a superpower. That guy with the detachable immune system that beats up people. I love it. Anyway, so the more carotenoids, the healthier the immune system is. And females that mate with brilliant orange males are going to leave more offspring than females that mate with drab males, because females that mate with drab males have less healthy offspring than females that mate with bright males. So this seems to be a general reason why you get a lot of reds and yellows as targets of sexual selection. Like cardinals, for example, or orioles or scarlet tanagers would have such bright colors. It's basically a way that the males can tell the females, hey, you want to have my babies? I've got killer genes and they give me a terrific immune system. Oof, right. Okay. Related to this is an idea that was worked on by an Israeli biologist named Amos Zahavi, studying a common Israeli bird called the Arabian babbler, which happens to have very complex social behavior. Arabian babblers are really cool. This is not an Arabian babbler, by the way. That's a peacock. And, when the male peacock is trying to find the ladies, he can spread this enormous tail that he's got. And, it's got these beautiful iridescent colors on it, and he'll walk around and shake it. And Zahavi noticed that not just the peacock's tail, but a lot of traits that are favored by mates, on the face of it, they look like survival handicaps. Because, first of all, that male is going to spend a huge amount of energy growing feathers that big. Remember, the feather's mostly protein. Keratin is a protein. So that's a huge amount of protein he's got to crank out to build a tail that size. And he's got to carry it around. Even when it's folded, it's a significant weight and it's going to make it more difficult for him to fly. So why would females prefer a trait that would seem to put the males at a disadvantage? Zahavi concluded that the reason why females prefer males that have a trait that's a disadvantage is because the trait is a disadvantage. Put it this way, it's game day outside Razorback Stadium, and everybody is tailgating. Everybody is calling the hogs and wearing their red and white and yelling "Woo Pig Suey" and wearing those funny pig hats and playing bago and barbecuing ribs and drinking beer. Okay, you got the scene? Everybody's tailgating outside Razorback Stadium. Whoa, pig suey! All of a sudden, I show up and I start walking through the tailgating area, my body painted in brilliant white and orange, picking a banjo and singing Rocky Top. For those who don't know, those are symbols of one of our football rivals, the University of Tennessee. By the way, do you know why Tennessee's colors are orange and white? It's so fans can wear them to the game on Saturday, wear them illegally hunting on Sunday, and wear them picking up trash by the side of the road during the week. Okay, if anybody's a Razorbacks fan, you'll find that funny, although considering the past few football seasons, there hardly seems to be much point. Anyway, so let's say I do something outrageous like that. If I do that and I get out of it alive, that must mean that I am either very intimidating and able to fight off a bunch of drunk Razorbacks fans, or I'm extremely fast and able to outrun a bunch of drunk Razorbacks fans, or I'm very smart and am somehow able to talk a bunch of drunk Razorbacks fans out of beating me up and leaving me for dead in a ditch. So my trait is a handicap to my survival, running around wearing Tennessee colors in the middle of a bunch of crazed Razorback fans is a definite handicap. But if you can do it and pull it off and survive, it must mean that you have really good genes, that you're either really fast or really strong or really smart or some combination thereof. And so that's the idea behind the handicap principle. If a male has a handicap, but he still survives, that must mean that he's got very good genes otherwise. That handicap trait becomes a signal that the male can't possibly fake. If a peacock can grow a tail that big and still survive to adulthood, then that peacock must be really strong because he's carrying around a huge tail. And he must have really good metabolism because that tail's all made out of keratin proteins. So the tail may be a handicap, but the fact that it is a handicap is the reason why it's favored in sexual selection. And the reason is that because the tail's a handicap, it is a very good marker of good genes. So here's another example. That's the bower of an Australian bowerbird. The males spend ridiculous amounts of time and energy building these tower-like structures out of twigs called bowers. In some species, the bowers can get up to 2 feet high. And the males will not only build these, they'll then decorate them. This one has an impressive pile of red fruit outside. They'll pick up shiny stones. They'll pick up, I think I read about a wildlife photographer whose camera lenses kept missing because bowerbirds were stealing them to put outside their bowers because they were shiny. They'll just get anything that they can to draw the female's attention. There we go. There's a male bowerbird. You can see he's got a blue feather in his beak, and right there's a blue bottle cap, which he's also picked up because it's brightly colored and it's blue. And females will mate with the males that have the most attractive bowers. That has been claimed as an example of the handicap principle because these bowers are completely useless. They're not used, they're not nests, they're not used as shelter, or not for long. And they're decorated with all of these things that take a huge amount of time for the bird to collect. Time that bird could be spent on feeding or doing other things with a greater survival advantage. They also might alert predators, hey, there's a bowerbird here. So this has been claimed as an example of the handicap principle. And last I looked, this was still being studied. There may be other factors at work as well. Okay, we kind of talked a little about this earlier, looking at those heliconius butterflies, but here I'll show it in the case of anolis lizards. This is the American anole, Anolis carolinensis. I used to see these guys in my backyard all the time when I grew up in South Louisiana. There were green lizards. Sometimes they could be brown. The locals called them chameleon, but they're not really chameleons. My dogs used to eat them whenever they got the chance, and then come inside and throw them up on the floor. So, yeah, half digested lizard parts are not fun to clean up. And the male, this is a male, and you can see that right here he's got this throat pouch. It's called a dewlap, and he can inflate it. It's not always sticking out like this, but this one has inflated his dewlap. The dewlap is rather brightly colored. It's red with white scales making a pattern. And when he is ready to find a babe, he will crawl out onto an exposed leaf and inflate his dewlap and start bobbing his head, calling attention to this brightly colored dewlap that he's got. Okay, there we go. Now, carolinensis is the only species that's native to the Southeast United States. Some of you might have seen these if you grew up in Arkansas, because I think they get into the southern half of the state. I don't think they make it quite this far north. But if any of you folks are from Hamburg or El Dorado or Callion or Saratoga or something like that, you may have seen things like this. You may have seen Anolis carolinensis. Now, Anolis carolinensis is the only native species in this country, but in Central America and the Caribbean, there's over 350 species of them. If the beagle had gone astray and ended up in the Caribbean and never made it to the Galapagos, Charles Darwin could still have written The Origin of Species, except he might be talking about lizards instead of finches. It's a very similar situation, although on an even bigger scale, because different lizards have different species on them, and each species is adapted for a particular niche and a particular diet. It's a great system to study the same kinds of phenomena that Darwin saw in the Galapagos. So there you've got a couple of males of two different species, both of which have inflated their dewlaps, and they'll inflate the dewlap and then do this head nodding or push-up dance, which is exactly what it sounds like. They'll hold their head up and then bob it down and up and down and up. Okay, some of this could well be good genes because the colors are very often red and yellow. And as far as I know, males or females prefer males with brighter colors. And remember, red and yellow are usually produced by carotenoid pigments, which are markers of good health and especially good immune systems. So some of this is probably that. But we can take it further. Remember, these hypotheses are not exclusive. Different species of anole have different dewlap patterns, and they also tend to have different rhythms of the push-up dance that they do. On the left is Anolis sagrii. Sagrii, by the way, has been introduced to the southern United States. During the quarantine last year at about this time, my sister kind of adopted an Anolis sagrii that was in her yard, and she'd feed it and it would come when she brought food. She named it Fluffy, of course. Anyway, that is Fluffy, or one of Fluffy's relatives, Anolis sagrii on the left. On the right, that's another species, Anolis mestrii. They're both found in Western Cuba, and they're both found on lower tree trunks. And you can see that they've got very different dewlap patterns. These are three Central American species. This top graph, they both have time going in the X direction. That top graph shows the head bobbing rate and amplitude. So this one will go up, down, up, down, up, 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 down, up, down, up, down. And this one will go up, up, down, up, down. Sorry, it's kind of hard to convey, but you can see that the top graph of each of these pairs shows a different rhythm of head bobbing. The bottom graph shows the inflation and the deflation of the dewlap. These two, limifrons and townsendii, inflate their dewlap for long periods. Sericius right here tends to pump the dewlap. It'll inflate and then deflate, inflate, deflate, inflate, deflate. It tends to pump it instead of just inflating its dewlap and holding it there. So different species have different dewlap patterns, different head bobbing rhythms, and different rhythms of inflating and deflating the dewlap. And we think this is because females who mate with the wrong species will probably have decreased fitness, because hybrid anolis, when we find them, are usually sterile, right? If you're a female sagrii and you mate with a male mestrii, if you're in the species on the left and you mate with the species on the right, you're not going to have very many offspring, because hybrids may be selected against, and hybrids are often sterile. If you're a sagrii, if you're one of the ones on the left, and you mate with a male of your own species, you are much likely to have successful offspring. So females that have a genetic preference for males that look like this are going to have more babies than females that have a preference for males that don't look like this. And males that clearly signal, hi there, I am Anolis sagrii, here is my sagrii dewlap that doesn't look like any other species. Those males that can clearly signal what species they belong to, they're going to leave more offspring than males that are like, hey, I don't know, I could be anything, whatever. I've got a pretty dewlap. You can't really tell what species it is, but whatever, man. Males that don't clearly signal what species they belong to are going to have fewer offspring than males that do. And females that strongly prefer the pattern of their own species are going to leave more offspring than females that don't care. So females with strong preference for their own species will have increased fitness. Males that can match the female's preferences will also have increased fitness. And the end result is that each species in areas where they live together should evolve a distinctive display pattern. I tell you what, I've got 9:58. There's more we could go into, but this is actually a pretty good time to take a break. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.